Hey guys, welcome to our Friday video. So today we're looking at a motherboard, CPU and RAM bundle with the focus on content creation. I got a lot of comments about building a dedicated streaming PC, for example, or doing video editing on such a Xeon system. So we've got a motherboard with a very hard to pronounce name. I'm just gonna call this KLLISRE. So this is a socket 2011 motherboard. It comes with 32 gigabytes of RAM and an 8-core processor. This one is a Xeon E5-2650 V2. Prices can always be a little bit sketchy on AliExpress. At the time of me agreeing to doing this video, it was just over $200 US. These parts have been supplied for free from an AliExpress seller. They got in touch with me, and after a bit of back and forth, they agreed to send us this bundle. So in the video, we will go over all the specifications. I will have a close look at the motherboard, and yeah, I tested some streaming to Twitch and that worked really well. I also edited an entire video on the channel on this machine in 4K, and that also worked great. And then I ran a bunch of benchmarks, so you have some numbers to compare this to. So this is the processor, the Xeon E5-2650 V2, based on the 22 nanometer process from the Ivy Bridge generation. It's very power efficient. We have 8 cores and 16 threads. In terms of clock speed, we have a base clock of 2.6 gigahertz, but it will turbo up to 3 gigahertz when all cores are utilized. I had a look at power consumption. We're using a 650 watt deep cool power supply, 80 plus gold certified, and sitting idle on the desktop. The entire computer with graphics card, 32 gig of RAM and the processor, it consumed 46 watts, so that's pretty good. And running Cinebench R20 to stress all the CPU cores, I saw 124 watts. Cheap RAM is one of the highlights of the 2011 platform. So this comes with a 32 gigabyte quad channel memory kit consisting of 4 modules with 8 gigabytes each. These are registered ECC memory, and thanks to a quad channel controller in the CPU, we're getting very high memory bandwidth. So the type of memory they included is rated at 1600 megahertz. So that's actually a little bit less than what the CPU can take. The processor has an 1866 memory controller. So unfortunate that they didn't include 1866 megahertz RAM, but it's not a big deal. You can go into the BIOS. There's a section to overclock the RAM from 1600 to 1866. And that's the first thing I did. And all the tests and all the benchmarks have been completed with the memory running at 1866. And now let's have a closer look at the motherboard, and there's a lot to talk about. Firstly, it's got a very nice layout with the power connectors out of the way and at the spots where you can do some clean cable management. In terms of size, it's a little bit short of full ATX, so it won't quite reach the mounting holes down here. We have a nice selection of PCI Express slots. The processor has 40 PCI Express lanes, which is quite impressive for such an old processor. We're getting 2 16X, 1 4X and 1 1X, and they all work together. So it's not one of those motherboards where when you insert something here, then the M.2 doesn't work or something like that. They all work at the same time. And for content creation, this is very handy. You can use cards, for example, a 4K capture card, which uses a 4X slot. You can use a 10 gigabit Ethernet adapter to connect to your home network for fast data transfer, maybe Thunderbolt, maybe USB 3.2 Gen 2, so there are lots of options. We have an M.2 slot, and on this motherboard it works at the full speed, so we're getting PCI Express 3.0 with up to 4 lanes. We have 6 SATA controllers. Only the green one is SATA 3, the 5 other ones are SATA 2. Here's the chipset cooler, and although this motherboard has a model number X79P version 1.0, there's no X79 chipset. They use a range of chipsets that they have available. Some of them are recycled, and that's actually not a big deal for performance. All the important stuff is inside the processor, like the PCI Express lanes and the quad channel memory controller. All the slower stuff like the USB 2 and the SATA controllers, it's those peripherals that are connected to the chipset. And they're doing this obviously to save money. There's an ambient LED strip, and this one is red, and it actually has a breathing pattern which I haven't seen on some of the other motherboards. Down below we have a lot of connectors and headers. So here we have got the connector for front panel audio, 4-pin system fan goes here, SPDIF for digital audio goes here. We've got a USB 3 header and 2 USB 2 headers. There's also a display to show you the boot process and if there are any issues. We have an integrated PC speaker, and there's actually a jumper here that lets you disable the PC speaker. I got one comment saying that the post beep when you turn on the machine is annoying. So in that case, you can just remove the jumper and the PC speaker is disabled. To clear the BIOS and remove all the settings, you just shorten these two jumpers here. And here goes the front panel connector for power, reset, hard drive activity, and power activity LED. And there's also a debug header here. Not quite sure what that is used for. And some variants might have a serial port, but this motherboard does not. Here we have all the ports, 2 PS2, 6 USB 2, 2 USB 3, gigabit Ethernet, and audio. And in terms of chips, I had a look. Most of them are provided by chips from Realtek. The VRMs on this motherboard do have a cooler, and I saw pretty decent temperatures around the 50 and 60 degrees when running the Blender benchmark. It does depend a little bit on which type of cooler you're using. With a tower cooler, you will see slightly better CPU temperatures, but the VRM temperatures will be a little bit higher. But if you go with a cooler that blows air down, like I've been using in this video, then you will see some slightly better VRM temperatures. I also had a look at the VRM controller, and this one is an ISL 6367. So this is a 6+1 phase PWM controller. This is the processor cooler that I'm using. I bought it from AliExpress, and what I like about it is it mounts directly on socket 2011 without any fan adapters. It's not the best cooler. Cooling performance is average. It's perfectly fine for this processor. Under load running Blender, I saw temperatures in the 60s, and that's perfectly fine. It's got a 4-pin PWM controller and even has what seems to be some sort of RGB LED connector. I didn't have anything to connect this to, so I only connected the 4-pin, and it will then do a breathing RGB animation, which actually looks pretty nice. Other cooling options that worked really well is a 2011 tower cooler with heat pipes. So here you will see better processor temperatures, but less airflow around the VRM. So the VRM temperatures will be a little bit higher. And also a favorite of mine, the Deep Cool Gamma Archer. In the motherboard box, you can just use the supplied fan adapter. That one works great with this processor cooler. You can of course play games on such a machine, but it's not the focus of this video. Now the processor does not have integrated graphics, so I needed a video card. I'm using the GTX 1050 Ti because that's what I have available. For storage, I'm using a 240GB M.2 SSD. So this one is PCI Express Gen 3 by 2, and it runs at full speed on this motherboard, and especially in video editing, importing files, and yeah, just working with your project, this actually makes a difference compared to using a SATA SSD. With these Chinese motherboards, there are always a few little quirks, and because I've been working with quite a range of motherboards in past videos, I know exactly what to look for. Sleep mode is once again not working, so if you click on the power option in Windows 10 and select sleep, it will just disable the monitor, but the computer will still run at full blast. The other issue is the BIOS and lack of overclocking features. Although we are evaluating the 2650 V2, I did try an unlocked processor. I've got a 1650 V2, and at first it's very promising. We're getting multiplier options and even voltage control options in the BIOS. Unfortunately, they don't do anything. So zero overclocking on this motherboard with unlocked processors. I did get in touch with the seller, and I was hopeful that they might come back with a modded BIOS, but no luck. So basically no support. And if you're looking for overclocking, then this is probably not the motherboard to go for. I had a look on the usual places on Russian websites for a modified BIOS, but and although this motherboard is listed, the BIOS file was double or half the size. It wasn't matching, so I couldn't even try those. And now let's talk about performance and using such a system for content creation. So Twitch streaming was first on my list. I've never used that before, so it was a bit of a learning curve to figure everything out. But in the end, it was very successful. I actually announced the stream on YouTube and on Twitter. And for around 10 hours, the machine was running Dirt 3, I believe, and streaming. And yeah, without a hitch, it worked perfectly fine. So I used OBS Studio, and the machine was running Dirt 3 with ultra details while also doing the encoding on the CPU. So I used the X264 option with 6 megabits per second upload speed and also the faster encoder preset. And there were no dropped frames. And I checked on 2 other computers how the stream quality looked like, and it looked perfectly fine. Also some subjective experiences with video editing. So I use Cyberlink Power Director, and the machine I usually do my video editing on is a HP OEM small form factor PC. It's got an i7 4770, so that's the comparison I had. And firstly, editing the video in 4K, it worked perfectly fine. It felt similar to the i7 4770. The difference was when, for example, I would double click on a clip, it will open it in the editor. Things like that took a little bit longer compared to the i7, because the i7 has a higher clock speed, so it's got faster single threaded performance. But things such as the actual encoding or the rendering process at the end, that ran a lot faster on the Xeon because it's got 8 cores and 16 threads. And although they only run at 3 gigahertz, they still can get a lot more work done. I also compared Handbrake. So on the Xeon 2650 V2, it encoded a 1080p 60 game capture at 58.8 FPS compared to the i7 4770, which took 38.5 FPS. So video encoding is definitely a strength of this platform simply because we have so many cores. More benchmarks in Cinebench R20, we're getting 2260. I also ran Geekbench 4. I will put a screenshot on the screen. We're getting a multi-core score of 21,673. I then ran Passmark, and for the processor, we're getting 14,242. I've got some more benchmarks, and I will just put the results on the screen. So I ran CPU-Z, which has a benchmark for single-threaded and multi-threaded performance. I also ran the Blender benchmark. The first benchmark, the BMW, that already takes quite a time, but then the Classroom benchmark takes even longer. So I stopped after it completed the BMW benchmark. And I also ran the user benchmark, which analyzes the entire system. And yeah, the figures seem pretty good. I will put a link down below in the description where you can check out all the results with all the details. So guys, I hope that answers the question if you can use such a Xeon system to build a dedicated Twitch streaming box. Absolutely, the performance was perfectly fine, and it was even running a game while doing the encoding. But I got more requests on if you can use such a system to build a dedicated streaming PC and then install a capture card and then play off your console or on a second PC. And video editing was also perfectly fine on this machine. The biggest difference is definitely when you produce or render the video. Here the 8 cores and 16 threads will just get the work done faster. In terms of working on the timeline and cutting videos and rearranging videos, not much of a difference. In fact, the i7 felt a little bit snappy and more responsive at times, simply because those tasks are very likely running on a single thread, and here the i7 is clocked higher. But the difference was very minimal, so I think overall this is still a fairly decent platform to do your video editing on. And now we're going to talk about value and also address some of the risks of buying components from AliExpress. So firstly, you need to look at your local market. Do you have access to used parts? What are the prices like for new parts? And then do the numbers. The 32 gigabytes of RAM is definitely the highlight, but I have seen prices for DDR4 memory is coming down still. If you're looking at machines with 32 or 64 gig of RAM, then the 2011 platform still has a price advantage. In terms of upgradability, we are using a quite old platform, but this was a very high-end platform. So in terms of processors, you can go up to 12-core, 24-thread CPUs, which is pretty nice. RAM can go up to 64 gig, and we've got a nice selection of PCI Express slots. So 4K capture cards, Thunderbolt, USB 3.2 Gen 2, or 10 gigabit Ethernet controllers are all upgrade options for the future. The lockdown bias in terms of overclocking is a real shame. In a few years, a unlocked 6-core or 8-core processor might become more affordable because of the Ryzen processors just putting a lid on how much you can charge. Unfortunately, with this motherboard, you won't be able to overclock the multiplier at all. Usually you get around 4 gigahertz out of these CPUs. And if you compare an 8-core processor running at 3 compared to 4 gigahertz, that's a 30-40% boost. So definitely something you will notice. Now, overclocking aside and the issue with the sleep mode, this is actually a really nice main board. And what I like is that they address some of the quirks that some of the other motherboards have. For example, on most motherboards, you will find 3 PCI Express 16 slots, but one of them only runs at 4X. So here they specifically put in a 4X slot. So you get exactly what you're seeing. And the same thing with the SATA controllers. They've colored one in green, so you know exactly, okay, that one is SATA 3 and the other ones are SATA 5. And you also get the advertised M.2 speed running at PCI Express Gen 3x4. That's also nice. The only other sketchiness is really the mentioning of SLI, which simply does not work. And finally, be aware that you're buying from AliExpress from China. So there is no local warranty. There's no support, basically, like we saw with getting modified BIOS to do some overclocking. So these are all factors that you need to consider when making a decision. But yeah, I'm really eager now to hear from you guys. What do you think about such a system and using it as a dedicated streaming PC or for video editing? And yeah, what alternatives would you consider? And that's basically it for this video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Give it a like if you enjoyed it. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And I shall see you soon with another one.